What if the darkness destroying humanity never truly began with humanity itself? What if behind every empire consumed by violence, every kingdom destroyed by corruption, and every generation overwhelmed by hatred, there was something far older watching from the shadows? For thousands of years, mankind has blamed itself for the chaos of this world, the wars, the cruelty, the bloodshed, and the endless cycle of corruption repeating through every civilization. But ancient writings hidden from most people tell a far more disturbing story. A story about an ancient being connected to hostility, temptation, and the corruption of mankind. A name almost erased from history. A name feared in forgotten scripture. Mastema. Most people have never heard of him, and perhaps that was the point, because according to ancient texts, Mastema was not merely a demon, he was something far more mysterious, a being associated with persecution, destruction, and the manipulation of human weakness itself. And unlike many dark entities described in ancient tradition, he was never fully removed. In fact, some texts suggest he was allowed to remain. But why? Why would such a being be permitted to influence humanity? And if these ancient writings were telling the truth, what happens if Mastema's influence never ended? What if the hostility consuming the modern world is part of something much older than civilization itself? And what if humanity has been losing a hidden spiritual war since the very beginning?
Buried within forgotten scriptures, hidden from most modern readers, exists the story of a being feared by ancient writers, a name connected to corruption, hostility, temptation, and the spiritual downfall of mankind. His story appears inside the Book of Jubilees, an ancient text once known by early religious communities, but later removed from many biblical traditions. And within its pages, we discover something deeply unsettling. After the destruction of the ancient world, after the flood wiped out the Nephilim and the corruption spreading across the earth, something still remained. Not flesh, but spirits. Ancient spirits said to continue influencing humanity from the shadows. And according to the text, there was one being who sought authority over them, Mastema, a mysterious figure associated with accusation, persecution, and the corruption of mankind. But the most terrifying part of the story, Mastema did not act alone. He asked permission to keep some of the spirits alive under his command, and according to the ancient account, that permission was granted. If you enjoy deep biblical mysteries, forgotten scriptures, and ancient stories hidden from history, subscribe now, because this story only becomes more disturbing from here. For centuries, the name Mastema remained hidden in the shadows of forgotten scripture. Most people have never heard the name, and yet ancient writers described him as a being deeply connected to humanity's corruption. In Hebrew tradition, the word Mastema is associated with hostility, hatred, persecution, and destruction. But who or what was Mastema truly supposed to be? Some ancient scholars believed he resembled Satan, the accuser, the tempter, the force working against mankind. But other interpretations suggest something even more mysterious. Because Mastema was not described as a fallen creature hiding in darkness from divine judgment, he appeared openly within heavenly scenes, speaking, requesting, accusing, and in some ancient accounts, receiving permission. That is what makes the story so disturbing. Mastema does not appear as a chaotic monster acting outside divine authority. He appears as a being allowed to operate within it, and that changes everything. Because if these ancient texts were meant to be taken seriously, then humanity's corruption may not simply be random evil spreading through history. It may be part of something older, something intentional. But the mystery surrounding Mastema becomes even darker after the destruction of the ancient world, because according to forgotten texts, his greatest influence began after the flood.
and what survived that catastrophe would continue haunting humanity for generations.
According to ancient biblical tradition, the world before the flood had become completely corrupted. Violence covered the earth. Humanity descended into chaos. And at the center of many ancient accounts stood the Nephilim, mysterious giant beings connected to the forbidden union between heavenly watchers and human women. These beings became symbols of corruption, destruction, and rebellion against the natural order. And so came the flood, a catastrophe so massive that it erased entire civilizations. The ancient world disappeared beneath the waters. The giants were destroyed. Their kingdoms vanished. Their bodies perished. But according to forgotten texts, something survived. Not flesh, not blood, but spirits. The Book of Jubilees describes evil spirits continuing to move among humanity after the flood, influencing, tempting, corrupting, leading mankind back toward violence and destruction. And then the story takes an even darker turn, because according to the ancient account, Mastema approached God with a request. He asked for some of the spirits to remain, so they could continue under his authority. And astonishingly, the request was granted. Not all of them, but enough to continue influencing humanity. And from that moment forward, the corruption of mankind did not simply come from human weakness alone. At least according to these ancient writings, it came from unseen forces moving silently among the nations, whispering into human hearts, feeding hatred, fueling violence, turning kingdoms against one another. And perhaps the most terrifying part, most people would never even realize it was happening, because corruption rarely arrives openly. It spreads slowly, quietly, through temptation, through pride, through anger, until entire civilizations collapse under the weight of their own darkness. But Mastema's influence would not stop with nations and kingdoms. According to ancient tradition, it would soon reach one of the most important figures in the entire Bible, Abraham.
Among all the stories connected to Mastema, none may be more disturbing than his role in the test of Abraham. Most people know the story. God commands Abraham to take his son Isaac to the mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. It is remembered as one of the greatest tests of faith in biblical history. But according to the Book of Jubilees, another figure stood behind the trial, Mastema. In the ancient account, Mastema challenges Abraham's loyalty. He questions whether Abraham's obedience is truly genuine, whether faith can survive pain, whether devotion can survive loss. And suddenly, the story becomes far darker, because this was no longer simply about obedience. It became a test designed to push a man to the edge of emotional destruction. Imagine Abraham walking silently beside his son, every step toward the mountain growing heavier, knowing what awaited at the top. And beside him walked Isaac, trusting his father completely, unaware of the agony tearing through Abraham's mind. The silence during that journey must have been unbearable. No armies, no battles, no demons appearing from the shadows. Only a father carrying unimaginable pain. And according to the ancient text, Mastema watched it unfold, watching to see whether suffering would break Abraham's faith. And perhaps that is what makes the story so terrifying. Mastema's influence was not always about open destruction. Sometimes it was about pressure, fear, temptation, suffering, the kind capable of revealing what truly exists inside the human heart. Because pain changes people. It exposes doubt. It reveals fear. It uncovers the hidden parts of human nature most people try to bury. And that raises a disturbing question. Was Mastema attempting to corrupt humanity, or simply exposing the darkness already living within it? Because if evil can influence human weakness, then the greatest battlefield may not exist somewhere out in the world, but inside the human soul itself. And now the question becomes even more unsettling. If Mastema influenced individuals, could he also influence entire nations? Comment below. Do you think Mastema and Satan are the same being, or are they completely different entities hidden within ancient scripture?
As the centuries passed,
ancient civilizations continued repeating the same cycle. Kingdoms rose, empires expanded, and then came corruption, violence, greed, betrayal, war. Again and again, humanity seemed unable to escape its own darkness. And according to ancient tradition, Mastema stood behind much of it. Ancient writers associated him with hostility, rebellion, moral collapse, and the corruption of nations. But not always through open possession or terrifying supernatural displays. That is what makes the idea so unsettling. His influence was believed to work quietly, through temptation, through whispers, through human weakness. A king consumed by pride, a nation driven by hatred, a society slowly losing its sense of morality, one act of corruption leading to another, one generation passing its darkness to the next. And over time, entire civilizations collapsed under the weight of their own corruption. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this ancient belief is how familiar it still feels today. Because even now, humanity remains trapped in the same cycle. Wars continue, violence spreads across nations, hatred consumes people online and in the streets, corruption infects governments, greed destroys lives. And despite all of humanity's technological advancement, the human condition remains strangely unchanged. We build larger cities, create more powerful machines, advance faster than any civilization before us. But spiritually, has humanity truly evolved at all? Or are we still fighting the very same darkness ancient writers warned about thousands of years ago? Because evil rarely arrives announcing itself. It spreads slowly, quietly, through influence, through compromise, through the small corruptions people learn to justify over time. And before anyone notices, a person changes, a nation changes, a civilization changes. That may have been the true danger ancient texts associated with Mastema. Not sudden destruction, but gradual corruption, the slow transformation of the human heart. But even after all of this, one terrifying mystery still remains unanswered. Why would a being associated with corruption ever be allowed to exist in the first place? But perhaps the most disturbing possibility about Mastema is that he was never meant to destroy humanity completely. What if his true purpose was something far more complicated? What if Mastema existed to test mankind? Because in several ancient traditions, there appears a mysterious figure known as the accuser, a being permitted to challenge humanity, to expose weakness, to test loyalty, to reveal what exists inside the human heart. The Book of Job presents a similar image, a heavenly accuser standing before God, questioning human righteousness, testing faith through suffering. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if Mastema represented a similar role? Not a force acting outside divine authority, but one operating within a system humanity barely understands. Because if corruption exposes weakness, if temptation reveals character, if suffering uncovers what people truly are, then what does that say about humanity itself? Perhaps the ancient writers feared something deeper than demons. Perhaps they feared human nature, because every act of hatred, every betrayal, every war, every corruption ultimately passes through the human heart first. And maybe that is why the story of Mastema feels so disturbing, because it forces humanity to confront a terrifying question. How much darkness comes from external forces, and how much already lives inside us? Maybe the greatest danger was never simply an ancient spirit manipulating civilization from the shadows. Maybe the greater danger is how easily humanity responds to corruption, how quickly people embrace pride, violence, hatred, greed, power. And throughout history, those weaknesses have destroyed kingdoms more effectively than any army. Civilizations collapse, nations fall, families break apart,
not always because evil attacks openly, but because corruption slowly takes root within ordinary people. And perhaps that is the true warning hidden inside these forgotten texts, that the greatest spiritual battle may not happen somewhere beyond the world, but inside every human soul. And if that is true, then the final mystery surrounding Mastema becomes even more terrified.
Whether Mastema was meant to be understood as a literal being, a symbolic force, or something in between, the warning hidden inside these ancient texts remains the same. Hatred corrupts. Violence spreads. Temptation rarely arrives openly, and civilizations collapse when humanity slowly embraces darkness. For thousands of years, empires have risen believing they were invincible. Kingdoms expanded, nations gained power, people pursued wealth, control, and domination. But eventually, corruption consumed them from within. And perhaps that is the most chilling part of all. The destruction did not always begin with armies. Sometimes it began with pride, with greed, with hatred people learned to justify, one small corruption becoming another, until entire societies could no longer recognize the darkness growing inside them. And maybe that is why stories like Mastema survived for so long, not merely to frighten people, but to warn them, to remind humanity that evil does not always appear as monsters rising from the shadows. Sometimes it appears through ordinary people consumed by anger, through leaders corrupted by power, through societies that slowly lose their sense of morality. And according to these forgotten writings, that is when destruction truly begins. Because the greatest danger may not be demons or fallen angels, but humanity's willingness to embrace darkness when it becomes convenient. The ancient texts never promised evil would disappear. They warned humanity to recognize it, to resist it, to understand how easily corruption spreads once people stop questioning it. And perhaps that is why the story of Mastema still feels disturbing today, because despite all human progress, the same hatred, the same violence, the same corruption still follows civilization wherever it goes. And maybe the final warning hidden inside these forgotten scriptures is that the greatest spiritual battle was never only happening around humanity, but within humanity itself. And perhaps the most dangerous corruption is the one humanity no longer notices.
If you enjoyed uncovering this forgotten biblical mystery and want more deep stories about fallen angels, ancient scriptures, Nephilim, watchers, and hidden truths buried within forbidden texts, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because some of the most disturbing stories in human history are the ones most people were never meant to read. And now we want to hear your thoughts. Was Mastema truly an evil force corrupting humanity from the shadows? Or was he something far more complicated? A tester, an accuser, a being meant to expose the darkness already living inside mankind? Comment your thoughts below. And if this story disturbed you, share this video with someone who loves forgotten biblical mysteries and ancient hidden history. Because the deeper we search into these ancient texts, the darker the truth becomes.